And I'm pleased and honored to bring in right now someone who is at the center of this as well with a lot to say. Professor Emeritus at Harvard Law School, Alan Dershowitz. Professor Dershowitz, you just wrote a recent book called The 10 Big Anti-Israel Lies, How to Refute Them with Truth. You know, what is the truth here? Because they keep saying, oh, this is free speech. What I saw was Jewish students scared, attacked on campus. I'd like to get first your reaction, then we'll get into former President Obama's stance on this.
I want everybody to imagine it's the 1950s. The Supreme Court has just ended segregation, and the University of Mississippi is harassing Black students, not allowing them to come to class, making life miserable for them, teaching white supremacy in the classroom. And the federal government comes in and says, unless you change your ways and start teaching fairly and start treating Black students equally, we're going to cut off federal funding. Every liberal in the world would be applauding that decision. Every liberal, every civil liberties group, every Democrat, every leftist would say, wow, isn't that the right way to go? To stop teaching racism, to stop harassing Black students. But today the shoe is on the other foot, and the students who are being harassed are Jewish students. And what is being taught is anti-American, anti-Christian, anti-Jewish ideological values in many of the classrooms. And so we see hypocrisy, everybody claiming free speech, academic freedom. They wouldn't be claiming it if the shoe were on the other foot.
Specifically when it comes to Obama, the former president calls this an unlawful attempt. But if you go back in history, he sued and the federal government sued Hillsdale College, which doesn't take any federal dollars, to force them into Title IX compliance, arguing being tax exempt means you're subject to federal control. So you can't have it both ways. And obviously him coming to the defense here of Harvard, many say this is part of the issue. It is Marxism. It is steeped in, and it's been decades in the making, and now it is festering. We all see it clearly with our own eyes, but this is something that sadly, Harvard is continuing to perpetuate. What would you say to the president? What would you say to alums who are still making donations to that $53 billion endowment, Professor Dershowitz?
I can tell you, I know many alums, including people I know very closely and faculty members like me, who won't give a penny to Harvard until they change their attitudes. Look, Obama is part of the problem. Sanders is part of the problem. They love the fact that Harvard has become ideologically left, that 95% of the faculty are Democrats, and that students feel very inhibited about speaking in class if they're conservatives, if they're Christians, if they're Jewish, if they're Zionists. Harvard has become a place where one-sided ideology dominates. That doesn't mean that the Trump administration is correct in cutting off research grants for the cure of cancer or Alzheimer's. The targeting has to be selective. And, Harvard is sending double message. On the one hand, its president, who I know and admire and I like, wrote a very strong letter designed to get the faculty behind him, because the faculty is very left and very anti-Trump. On the other hand, they hired as their two lawyers to represent them in their dispute with the Trump administration, two very, very Trump-affiliated lawyers. And so they're sending a message to the Trump administration: don't necessarily listen to what we're saying to our faculty, listen to our lawyers. And I'm sure there'll be negotiations. I've read the letter very carefully that Harvard sent to Harvard, that the government sent to Harvard. And many of the things in the demand of the government are good, are right. Harvard ought to do it. They ought to do it on their own. Some go too far. And that's why we have negotiations. Trump's a negotiator. And now we know by who Harvard hired to be their lawyers, they're also negotiators. And so in the end, we will see, hopefully, a negotiation. Otherwise, I don't want to see the losers be research on cancer and other kinds of research that are funded by the federal government. We need a resolution here, and I think a resolution is possible. But Harvard has to be willing to make changes, because the current status quo is just not fair to conservative students, to Jewish students, to many American patriotic students, to Zionist students. It's just not fair. And people feel that they're not safe, intellectually safe, emotionally
Of
safe,
course.
even physically safe. Students were beat up at Harvard, including by a man who, or threatened and harassed by a man who was an editor of the Harvard Law Review. So, the environment there has been very dangerous.
Yeah, I remember covering
since
that.
October 7th. On October 8th,
Certainly.
the day after, before Israel sent a single troop into Gaza, 32 Harvard groups, 32, blamed it all on Israel and said it was all Israel's fault to have 1,200 Israelis killed and 250 taken into custody. That shows you a lot of the atmospherics around Harvard. Now, there is free speech, but you have to have both sides. The marketplace of ideas.
What you say is the
Harvard today does
negotiation.
not
Yes.
have a marketplace of ideas.
Well, we look and see if there is some type of resolution. Right now, it seems like they have outwardly rejected it. Speaking of resolutions, while we have you, a big case today, a 4 p.m. hearing. Let's talk about Kilmar Brego Garcia.
Yeah.
He was deported on a clerical error. Yesterday, the president of El Salvador sat right there in the Oval Office saying, I can't smuggle him back into the United States. He's in this big prison there, the mega prison, if you will. He is an El Salvador national. Now, the question around all of this is what happens next? What does the Trump administration have to facilitate or effectuate? There's the Supreme Court ruling. And, a lot of folks on the left are using this man, the Maryland man, who Pam Bondi says was found to be an MS-13 gang member, as sort of this, narrative of a deportation that should have happened, while other folks are saying there was enough here to get him out of the country. And now that he's gone, the United States has no business going, Stephen Miller says, kidnapping him. Where do you fall on this, and what do you think will happen at 4 p.m. today?
Well, I have no doubt that he's deportable. He's an illegal immigrant, and he's deportable as a result of that. The problem is that an immigration court halted his deportation in order to evaluate his claim of sanctuary. He claims that he will be killed if he's sent to a prison in El Salvador. And so there was a clerical mistake. They shouldn't have sent him back. But if he is taken back to the United States after an hour or 2-hour hearing, he'll be found deportable. So in the end, he'll be deported. The question is whether he has to come back to the United States, get his hearing on whether or not he's entitled to asylum, and then be deported. He is deportable. There's no doubt about that. The only question is whether or not he has the right to stay here, not as an illegal alien, but as somebody who is subject to the possibility of being hurt in Salvador.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very, very technical at this point. If I were the Trump administration, what I would do is have him flown back to the United States, give him a hearing for a few hours, go through the issues, see whether or not he's really subject to being hurt in Salvador. If so, send him to a different country. But they'll win ultimately on the issue of him being deportable because he's an illegal alien, and illegal aliens have no right to stay in the country.
Well, maybe the administration will choose to do that. We're waiting for the White House briefing at 1. Before, as we're hearing from Democrats, that Senator Chris Van Hollen and others, including Maxwell Frost, said they will go to El Salvador. Obviously, this is now political football. The left is trying to make a big case out of it. Professor Dershowitz, we're going to watch this hearing. We appreciate your thoughtful comments today on Harvard University, and always a pleasure to have you in with us, sir.